Hello from me. My name is Nicole Jacobs, and I'm the designate domestic abuse commissioner for England and Wales. And I'm really, really proud to be here to support Lars in this event tonight. And we have some great speakers ahead of us. And I really think some good discussion that we'll be able to have. I just want to explain a little bit about why I'm so strongly supporting these amendments to the bill, where we are with the bill very quickly. I think most of you will know, surely you've come here because you're so interested and supportive of the bill. And then I'll explain a little bit about the format of our event tonight. But what is really obvious about the domestic abuse bill at this stage is how much these key amendments are really missing from what is often described a landmark bill. And the government has accepted changes to the bill, has shown a real willingness to take on amendments and amend the bill themselves. And yet we don't have changes in this area just yet. Although there is a glimmer of hope, because obviously the amendments have been successful in the Lord's stage of the bill. And as we move to the Commons, this is a really, really critical time for us all to have a good discussion tonight, really fully understand and hear from some experts about these provisions, and also think about what we can do now in these this very last push in terms of the improvements needed for the domestic abuse bill. So, it goes without saying that it's really clear that without any doubt, provisions for migrant women are different from others. We have much more limited provision, what can be offered, the types of safety that can be offered and reassurances. And that's why these amendments are so important. We know from Women's Aid, the Routes to Support statistics from 2017, for example, that over a fourth of the people who were turned away from refuge that was due to no recourse to public funds. And we had an IMCON report, one of quite a few very important reports put out by IMCON this year, but one was about the initial stages of lockdown and what their member services were experiencing up through to the end of April 2020. And what they were seeing was a huge surge in demand for their services. And that ranged from 60 to 300% in terms of people seeking support and advice. And I think we have to keep in mind, the overall context that we came into this pandemic with in terms of these really drastic gaps in services for migrant women, and the context of what these services have had to do in order to address needs in the last year in that context. And I'm really pleased that we're going to hear some of and really be able to air some of the reality of what that's like and what that has been like for individual survivors and how hard that has been for services. But the amendments, just to be clear, are about creating a firewall between police and immigration enforcement. This has been put forward by the Step Up to Migrant Women campaign, which has been led by Lars. And we'll hear from Gisela, who will tell us more about that, obviously. The next amendment is about extending eligibility for the Ddbc and DVR, and this is something very much led by Southall Black Sisters. We have Pragna here tonight, in our lineup of speakers. And it includes, the third amendment is in relation to a non-discrimination clause in the bill to ensure equal protection and support for survivors regardless of status. And that's been led by the End Violence Against Women Coalition. And obviously, there have been incredible leaders within the Lords who have picked up these amendments and really worked quite a lot together on a cross-party basis. And shown a huge strength of support. I don't know about you, but I've been particularly impressed by the Lord's stage of the bill and the quality of debate and the desire to improve the domestic abuse bill by the Lord. So what we've seen is a great support within the Lords for these provisions. And now we need to really do whatever we can to make sure that the Commons address these amendments and we get them passed. And so over to the bulk of the event. Before we do, I just wanted to remind everyone we're recording. Also that we're using a hashtag #DABill4all with the number 4. So to please use that if you possibly can. We're not going to use the chat during the main plenary session, but when we break out into 4 groups, which we will do after the speakers, you'll be able to use the chat then. And I just wanted to kind of explain a little bit about our format. We're going to have a survivor testimony first, which will be read out to us. And then we'll have a few speakers, each speaking about 5 to 7 minutes. It's going to be really hard because I so admire these folks. As a chair, this is going to be really hard to try to keep them to time. But I will try to do that, because what we'd like to do at about 6:45 is to get into some breakout rooms where you'll all come into a room with one of the speakers. And we'll just ask some really key questions, clarify anything that you'd like to talk about, think about how we can raise awareness, what can be done to influence Parliament. Just so it's a nice discussion in smaller groups. And then we'll come back and end for 7:30. So just so everybody kind of understands the running order of things. The first person I'd like to introduce is Sandhya Sharman, who's the co-director of Safety4Sisters in Manchester, which is a feminist frontline organization working to support migrant women with no recourse to public funds. So I will hand over and we'll hear, a survivor testimony that will be read out.
Thank you very much. And I think it's really fitting that we start off with a survivor testimony. The survivor herself is a member of Safety4Sisters Migrant Women's group based in Manchester, and she's very bravely and courageously added her voice to this really important event, and also to remind us really that women are at the heart of this, at the start and at the end, and it's their voices and their experiences that we work from. So it's naturally quite harrowing. So just to let you know that before I read it out. My name is Janat and I come from a very conservative Muslim family from Bangladesh. My father was a senior legal official and my family is well known in the society. Working at a high up level in the legal profession, my father saw how miserable life was for women, especially those who are divorced in our society, and how they were turned into burdens on their families. He saw suicides, murders because of domestic violence, and he tried to prevent us from experiencing that pain. He was also very careful about our higher education. He never thought to put us into marriage before the completion of our education and self-independence. I myself completed a master's degree and worked part-time. I wanted so much and I felt I could achieve so much in my life as an independent woman. I was popular amongst my siblings and cousins because of the hard work, and also because I supported my entire family, standing by my father. I was like a son to my parents, and even more so than that. While studying for my master's, I joined a bank and I realized that my dream was to be educated further with a foreign degree, so I could pursue my career in Bangladesh. I was very anxious about telling my father, but when I told him, he said, yes, you can, and he gave me his consent. I made it, but my father did not get to see it. He passed away in 2011, and I came to the UK in 2012 on a student visa, carrying my father's soul and words with me. This is still with me every day, the only man in my life who loved and believed in me unconditionally. While studying, I got married to a very handsome imam of a mosque. It was arranged. After the marriage had taken place, I found out that he was more serious about going to the mosque and his Islamic political party activities than going to university or work. I slowly came to realize that actually he had stopped his studies and regular work and was becoming increasingly dependent on me and controlling of my money. He was a false imam and he was addicted to pornography. Beating me became his habit, and whenever we argued, he would violently beat me and rape me. I was admitted to hospital several times with injuries and had to take a tetanus injection when he bit me so hard on my body. He knew I had insecure immigration status, and he would use this all the time to threaten me, as he knew how difficult it would be for me to leave, as I had no one else in the UK to turn to. Night after night, I spent in terror. I didn't have the energy to study or work, and the anxiety was killing me. I was desperate to continue my education, but due to the abuse, I failed in my MBA. I switched to an easier course that at least would give me some career push, but I had to work as a carer to get some money, as he was taking everything from me. Even my mother had to provide me with some tuition costs for my father's pension. I fled the house when it became too much and made an application for asylum. He was harassing my family in Bangladesh. After this, a joint friend called me and told me to look at his Facebook page. I did, and I was horrified. My husband had uploaded sexual images of me that he had taken without my consent for the whole world to see. He had posted these images on a porn site. He had done this to completely shame me and humiliate me. I thought of suicide as what choice did I have? I felt like I was being raped again and again. I had treatment and counselling and shut myself off from everything. I eventually told the police, but my solicitor was a man, and the police officers I told were men. I didn't think they understood just what was happening to me. The case was closed. It wasn't just the hell of the pictures, it meant I could not go back to Bangladesh. How could I when everyone had seen these photos? Because I was a migrant and I had no money, there was no one who could help. I couldn't get into a refuge or any other safe accommodation due to no recourse to public funds, and I had no money. My college was then shut down by the Home Office, and I didn't have a penny of the course fees back. The Home Office refused my case, and I was completely destitute. The Home Office told me I could go back to Bangladesh and relocate, but the world was treating me like a joke. I was getting my civil divorce at this time, and it was awful. But then I got help from a man who I thought was an angel. This man started to support me, told me he loved me, and helped me to overcome my situation. I got my divorce, and then I married this man Islamically. I didn't have children, but really wanted them, and I wanted a family and safety away from my past. He was a widow with children. I finally started to believe in myself and get more confidence. But after a week in the marriage, I wanted to change my address to our new marital address, but he stopped me, saying he didn't want the council or housing to know about me. After a while, I did it online myself, but he refused to register our marriage in a civil court. He told me, if you want to stay in this marriage, you have to stay like this, otherwise you can leave. Again, he knew I had no recourse to public funds and was very vulnerable, and he started taking advantage of my situation. Shortly after this, he gave me a verbal talaq, an Islamic divorce, threw me out the house. His son called the police and when I refused to leave, and he changed the locks and barred me. I had no money, no housing. A person I had met briefly took me in and tried to get me help from lots of women's groups, refugees, domestic violence groups, but they all refused because I had no recourse to public funds. After 3 months struggling, I was defeated and so went back to my husband, agreed to his demands. I was then just a maid, a servant. I became a sexual slave to him with no choice, no wish, and no freedom. He too was a man who watched lots of porn, and then he would become sexually violent to me. I had to remain silent. He would constantly threaten that he would call the Home Office and send me to a detention centre, and they would deport me. He knew everything about my family and how I would be treated if I went back to Bangladesh, but he didn't care. I had nowhere to go. I was literally enslaved. Finally, I got in touch with Safety4Sisters, who helped me get accommodation, financial support, and leave the abuse. I have left it behind me now, but still I am unable to gain secure immigration, as all these men have created a state of chaos and the Home Office don't believe me. Despite getting a divorce from my second husband, he is still threatening me and says he has rights over me. My younger sister is suffering as a result of what's happened to me, and no one will marry her. My mum is broken and finds it hard to talk to me. My family have disowned me and are horrified by the pictures they saw of me. They will never accept me back, and it will be dangerous and violent if I return. I am old and sick with several medical conditions. I have had 2 courses of pneumonia, which has killed my strength, and I have been very scared about COVID as I am clinically vulnerable. I have been homeless for a long time now, transferring from one unsafe place to another. I have lost all hope. Not being able to access public funds, housing and benefits when I arrived in the UK has taken away so much from me and keeps me in this state. It has punished me and made me feel like a criminal when I need support. Men have abused me, and the no recourse to public funds condition has taken away my dignity, hope, freedom and future. When I needed it the most, the UK government has shown me that I do not matter. I want the government to protect ladies like me. No one should have to stay in abuse because they have no recourse to public funds. Every woman should be treated equally. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you. I think that says it all, frankly. And when I listen to that, among many, many things I think about are the, having been in frontline kind of work before, how ill-equipped I would have been to be able to even touch on any of those needs, and how much we really need organizations like Safety4Sisters, and how much, aside from these amendments, we have so much to do in terms of many, many things that were raised by that testimony. We need these amendments, and we need a lot more, very, very clearly. So thank you so much for sharing that. And please, Sandhya, please pass along our thanks to the person who prepared that for us, and how incredibly moving that was to hear. I'll pass over to Rosie Lewis now. Rosie's the Deputy Director of the Angelou Center and manages the organization's Violence Against Women and Girls Services, which includes refuge provision for women without recourse to public funds. Rosie, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole. And I feel like we need to take a deep breath, or a sigh, a very loud sigh, a warrior sigh after that. And it actually makes what we're going to go on to talk about so much more important, because this is a lived reality, an ongoing lived reality for so many women as we speak. And we have a responsibility, just being the privilege of being at this event, and thank you to everybody who's come along and everybody who's organized this, but we have a responsibility to do this and to make change. So it's really great being here. The Angelou Centre is a Black and Minoritized led by and for organisation based in the northeast of England. And it's great to have such a lot of northern representation, which we will probably bang on about throughout this, but it's really important because the northern context, especially for migrant women, as I'm going to go on to say, is pretty different, you know. In the north, there are areas of great socioeconomic deprivation. There's historical rifts, obviously, that we know between the north and the south in terms of opportunities, and the well-being and socioeconomic outcomes of women and children up here in the north. But what's really important is that, actually, and something I want to bring into this discussion, is that it's a major dispersal area for women and children, vulnerable people who are seeking asylum. And that's often forgotten about, and that's outside of London and the South because of the prices of housing, and how there is this big crossover between the corporatization of immigration issues and matters and what happens to vulnerable women and children. So it's such an important event. It's such a pivotal time. You know, our rights, women's rights, Black and minoritized women's rights, migrant women's rights are under attack like we've never known. So as we're surviving a really authoritarian political regime that's using, for example, as we know recently with Sarah Everard, the dead body of a woman who was murdered by a man to further justify harm, incarceration, racial injustice, and the increase of surveillance in the hostile environment. But migrant women and women perceived to have no recourse to public funds, like we've already said, have been living amongst these regimes of scrutiny, state-sanctioned violence and abuse, and dehumanization for too long. Because what it means to have no recourse to public funds is to be excluded from society. And as I've said, and as I keep saying, to be dehumanized. It means that if you are abused, violated, harmed, even murdered, there is a little action or accountability placed on the perpetrators or on the state, which has a level of accountability, obviously. It means that your life is seen to be lesser than. It means that you're excluded from housing, from refuges, safety, support, protection, health, vaccination. You face hunger, destitution. You face your children being removed and placed with perpetrators. It means being punished by the state, criminalized for surviving the violence. It means going to generic mainstream services and white-led women's services, often, unfortunately, again and again. For most of the women we support, it's 9 times that they are sent back to their abuser before they're supported. It means that social, economic exclusion and that being under that constant scrutiny and surveillance if you ever manage to actually escape from the perpetrator or you're ever in public spaces. And it means living in that environment of hostility, harm, racism, constantly. So at present, we know that vulnerable women and children are being used by the state as political bargaining tools. Our immigration systems are closely tied to the same patriarchal sovereignty, nationalism, and authoritarianism that saw people who were protesting about the death of Sarah Everard being physically dragged and harassed in the same way that so many women are on a daily basis by male police officers. And the outcome of this is increased police powers and the diminishment of the right for us to protest, for us to work in solidarity. There is a constant attack. The domestic abuse bill exclusion, the exclusion of migrant women from domestic abuse bill, is really just exemplary of constant attack on our human rights and equalities, on our women's rights. So we don't need to be fooled into thinking that this isn't related to the wider reduction of our civil liberties and our rights. And we can't talk about feminism or solidarity or action in a liberal or carceral context. We have to be intersectional. And by that, we have to make sure that we bring the most marginalized women to the center of the struggle. Regionally, this inequitability is further compounded by the context of the fact that many grassroots, small organizations like Safety4Sisters are completely underfunded for the work that they do. It means that the organizations that are a lifeline to so many migrant women and women without recourse to funds receive less than 1/5 of what an equivalent white-led women's service will be receiving. So what do we need to do, sisters and allies? What do we need to do? Well, we need to localize our collectivist solidarity. We need, as I've said, to center the most marginalized. We need to consider their lived experience, like the narrative that Sandhya read out there. It's so important. We need to make sure that they are at the center of this struggle and that we are there to uplift and support their voices. We need to be involved in every cog of the machine, externally and internally. We need to do the front line, the strategic, the direct action, the policy, the practice, and more. We need to address this structurally, think locally and regionally, support our grassroots organizations. We need to resist together. And if we remember, detention is not far removed from what's happening in the domestic abuse bill. In 2010, we stopped women and children being put in detention, and we're back in this situation again, except it's been accelerated. In the northeast of England, and this is happening, this is going to be a pattern that we're going to see across the north and that we're seeing in Scotland, is that new detention centres are being built to incarcerate women and children. And in Hassickfield in the northeast, the detention centre that they're setting up here is a former Category 3 prison that won't be altered that much. So we need to support the campaign to include migrant women in the bill, but we need to connect the pieces and recognise the urgency of centering that support, uplifting the voices and expertise. We can resist the bill, but we need to resist so much more collectively.
Thank you, Rosie. I really, I've always am really, it's always very thought-provoking when Rosie speaks anywhere, and I just feel really lucky that we've been able to hear from you tonight. And I wanted to pass it over to Gisela Valle, who is the director of the Latin American Women's Rights Service since 2019 and has a background in human rights, feminism, gender strategy, and government. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here and being part of this conversation. Thank you as well to everyone that put this event together. It's really urgent and necessary to continue talking about migrant women. As you all know, the events of last week with the tragic death of Sarah Everard has reignited that conversation and that national consciousness of how vulnerable women are to experiencing violence in their lives and how often it is with fatal consequences. The subsequent conversation on social media also reminded us of the sheer prevalence and scale of the problem. As I imagine happened for many other women, I couldn't avoid thinking about the experiences most of us share and how easy it would be for any of us to suffer a similar fate. However, I have to say that I can't help but notice that there is part of the conversation that is hidden. Since although most women will experience violence at one or several points in their lives, state responses to such violence are not equal across the board. And I think it was great hearing Rosie talking about this. As we have heard from the survivor testimony read by Sandhya, migrant women are one of the most affected groups of this lack of or inadequate state responses. And particularly that's applicable to those with an insecure immigration status that is often dependent on the very person who abuses them. For specialist organizations such as Los Angeles, SBS, Safety4Sisters, and others, it is part of our routine to deal with the effects of immigration status used against survivors at two specific points. The first is as part of the abuse, when the abuser or abusers manipulate it to trap victims in violent situations, or when they use it to coerce, control, and psychologically abuse them. And second, by the system, when it allows it to take precedence over the safety and protection of survivors, their opportunities to recover and rebuild their lives, and their access to justice for them, but also often for their children. Although we believe that the domestic abuse bill is a positive step forward in strengthening provisions, protection, and support for victims of this terrible crime, it unfortunately fails to ensure equal access to its provisions for migrant women. We believe that this creates a two-tier system of state protection and provisions for survivors, consolidating on one hand provisions for one group, whilst equally consolidating structural barriers for the other. I just want to talk briefly about two amendments that we're proposing. The first is on non-discrimination, which is led by the End Violence Against Women Coalition. And it is asking the government to introduce a statutory duty on public authorities to ensure that services and support are accessible to all victims of domestic abuse without discrimination on any grounds, in accordance with Article 4.3 of the Convention. We know, because it's often discussed, how Istanbul is the international gold standard in responding to violence against women and girls. And Article 4.3 is one of its central principles, because its whole purpose is to ensure that protection is provided without discrimination. Now, as we've been discussing, as the testimony evidences, migrant status is particularly important here because of the unique barriers facing migrant women, such as barriers to reporting the abuse and the no recourse to public funds conditions that prevents them escaping the violence and accessing safety, protection, and justice. By enshrining in law the right of migrant women to access support and protection without discrimination, we would be removing a significant tool of power that perpetrators use and exploit, and we would enable survivors to access the means they need to escape abusive situations and hold perpetrators to account. This amendment would be complemented by a provision to establish safe reporting mechanisms for this group of survivors. As we all know, reporting domestic abuse to the police is often the first step in escaping it, particularly for women at imminent danger of harm or of losing their lives. However, migrant women experience a unique barrier in accessing this life-saving support They are afraid that the police will prioritize their immigration status over their safety and protection. This is a logical outcome of the language barriers and lack of knowledge of the system that they have, but more importantly, it is the result of perpetrators knowing this and using it to specifically threaten their victims. According to our own research, about 2/3 of migrant women reported this specific threat. According to INCAN's research, the proportion of migrants reporting this threat is higher. For women who have no option but to approach the police, and this is usually when the abuse has escalated significantly, questions around their immigration status and data sharing with immigration enforcement will crystallize those threats into a terrifying reality. Suddenly, they are faced with the impossible decision between their safety and destitution, deportation, and potential separation from their children. For many, enduring the abuse will be the lesser of two evils. The Domestic Abuse Bill has the potential to change this by incorporating an amendment to include a provision to prevent data sharing and therefore establish self-reporting mechanisms for survivors so they can safely report abuse to the police, social service, health professional, and other statutory services with confidence that they will be treated as victims without fear of immigration enforcement. This amendment has the added benefit of supporting statutory services work by providing clear legislative guidance to ensure systems that allow survivors' ability to escape the abuse, access safety, and rebuild their lives. This is supported by the findings and recommendations of the first police super complaint presented by South of Black Sisters and Liberty on data sharing between police and immigration enforcement. The super complaint found that often police forces lack clear guidance on supporting migrant survivors of domestic abuse, and they agreed that data sharing has a detrimental effect on the police's ability to access intelligence, investigate crime, and protect the public. Furthermore, the super complaint found that data sharing between the police and immigration enforcement does not safeguard victims of domestic abuse. Instead, it deters victims from coming forward to report this crime, which causes harm to the public interest. The super complaint itself recommends to establish safe reporting mechanisms for all migrant victims and witnesses, including those with insecure immigration status, so they can access police services. The Domestic Abuse Bill is the perfect vehicle to include this legislative provision and making sure that both victims and statutory services are clear on what the priorities are when it comes to domestic abuse. These amendments will also have the added benefit of sending a clear message that victims of domestic abuse will be believed, supported, and protected without discrimination, and that perpetrators would be held accountable regardless of the status of their victims. We ask everyone to support our work to ensure that these recommendations can be included in the Domestic Abuse Bill. There's a lot of opportunities to contact MPs, to take this message to the public, to discuss these issues and bring it into the open, asking the government to fulfill its responsibilities to domestic abuse survivors and making sure that no group of survivors is discriminated against. There's also opportunities to continue advocacy and lobbying at the local level and ensuring that specialist services that work with women, with migrant women, with women who are usually vulnerable and marginalized are adequately funded and their work supported. We really need to get rid of this commissioning system that really looks at numbers and not women and doesn't consider the different intersections and layers of inequalities that particular women experience at the same time at specific moments in their lives by virtue of their status, their race, their income and other factors. There needs to be, and I guess this is my last recommendation, I'm aware of time, we need to have solidarity and sisterhood in making sure that these messages are visible, are audible, and are out there, particularly when interacting with policy and decision making. So we can have the change that is required to make sure that the most vulnerable, marginalized, and invisible women are protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Gisela. I think you made so many important points, but I'm really glad you underscored the super complaint and the fact that, you know, how strongly that report suggests that we need to have this amendment. And I totally agree with you. I don't understand why the government wouldn't take the opportunity that's right in front of them in the domestic abuse bill to address that particular amendment. It seems such an obvious thing to do. So I'm really pleased that you said that. I also wanted to just say one of the recent commitments, well, it's not an accepted amendment in the bill, but the government has made a commitment and will collectively hold them to it, which is about consulting in the summer for extension of the statutory duty for community-based services. And so the services that you're talking about should rightly be obviously very much part of that statutory duty in terms of funding. And that with the view, so it's a kind of a formal consultation that they've committed to for this in the summer for the victims bill, which is another bill in the pipeline. So it's not a total victory in that respect, but it's an opportunity that we all need to be aware of and really get ready for in terms of making sure that we make the case for the buy and for services very much part of that consultation. I'm going to hand over to Pragna Patel, who probably needs no introduction, but in any case, she is the founding member and director of Southall Black Sisters. And I'm so glad we have some time, Pragna, maybe a little bit longer until, you know, until 6:45, because a really critical argument that the government makes in relation to these amendments is about data and the need for data. And I think Pragna is in a really perfect position to talk to us about the kind of funding that SBS has had in relation to this, in relation to helping people with no recourse to public funds, and why perhaps that argument is not as solid as put forward. So I'll hand over to you now, Pragna.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you very much, Laws, and everybody else. It's really good to be amongst friends and sisters and allies and others who are interested in this really important and concerning issue. I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of amendment, the amendment that we put forward as Southall Black Sisters with support from many of you on extension of the DV rule and the Ddbc, and the government's response to that. I want to actually focus on the government's response because we can dismantle all of them. And I think that's really important going forward. So, you know, I'd start by saying I think it was 6 July 2020, and the long-awaited domestic abuse bill passed in the House of Commons. And that was after 3 years of campaigning against a backdrop of immense political and social upheaval, you know, the general election, Brexit, and then now the global pandemic. So it's against this background that we've got this domestic abuse bill. And Southall Black Sisters, along with many of you who are present, who supported us, we've tried to include an amendment to the bill as part of a package of amendments that others have talked about, to achieve better protection for migrant women with insecure status, no recourse to public funds, are subject to abuse. And what we've tried to do is extend what already exists, which is the domestic violence rule and the Ddbc, which together, combined, have proved to be such an effective model of protection for migrant women who are abused and who are trapped in abuse. And so all we've asked the government to do is to extend this effective model to other women who arrive in this country under other types of visas other than spousal visas, which is only the DV rule and the Ddbc is only applicable to women on spousal visas. But we've asked that the DV rule and the Ddbc be extended for migrant women subject to abuse who've arrived on other types of visas. And it'll come as no surprise to any of you that in the House of Commons, our amendment was rejected. And despite the fact that this bill has been sort of, lauded as a cross-party effort, if you actually look at the voting records, you see that actually 330 Conservative MPs voted it down, compared to 207 MPs from Labour and Liberal Democrats and a few others who are in favour. So that just tells you that, this has become party political. It need not be. And that tells us something about the government's intentions here and its overall, Rosie pointed out so effectively, overall political intentions here in relation to immigration, full stop. On Monday, just gone, our amendment was laid by the Bishop of Gloucester in the House of Lords, where it was passed. And that was due to significant cross-party support. So I think I'm really heartened by the fact that in the House of Lords, we had champions who you would not necessarily imagine to be champions of, support of these kinds of amendments. That's really important. And two, the cross-party aspect of it is really important. And three, the growing consensus around the need to do something more for migrant women and to protect migrant women is very, very heartening. 20 years ago, when we all started out and we talked about no recourse, nobody knew what we were talking about. Now, not only do people know, but most people will agree that it's not fair, that it's not just, and that migrant women need to be included in the protection measures that this government's offering. So along with others, we've really been resisting the government's position. And I have to say, despite the fact that it got passed in the House of Lords, we're going to watch the government reject it in the House of Commons, along with all the other amendments. I'm predicting it now. So I think, when we talk about what we need to be doing, of course, we have to carry on lobbying and campaigning when it gets back to the House of Commons, but we also have to think about other ways. We've got to think creatively, we've got to think laterally, and we've got to think of other, other options, other tools that we should use. The government has relied on three key arguments as to why the DV rule and the Ddbc should not be extended. First of all, they say that unlike women on spousal visas, other migrant women on other types of visas have no, in inverted commas, legitimate expectation of settlement. That's the first point they make. The second point they make is that expanding eligibility for the DV rule and Ddbc to women on non-spousal visas could lead to exploitation or misuse of the immigration system, and that it could lead to an exploitation of vulnerable migrants themselves. And the third argument they make, and this is the one that Nicole was referring to, is that there is lack of robust evidence to support this amendment. And as a consequence, they've offered us the support for migrant women victims, the support for migrant victims scheme, otherwise known as the pilot project, which they want to try out for a year in order to collect evidence. So I want to actually go through these these arguments and show you why, when you look at them closely, they don't hold up. The first question, the issue of legitimate expectation. We have to remind the government that when the DV rule was introduced, initially as a DV concession back in 1999, in response to a parliamentary question that was asked of the government of the day, what's the purpose of the DV rule? The government said it was to enable abused migrant women who would otherwise remain trapped to leave an abusive relationship. So the purpose was not anything other than to protect and enable migrant women to leave. So this idea that, you know, it's about legitimate expectation is wrong. They did not introduce the DV rule and the Ddbc because women on spousal visas had a legitimate expectation to stay here. So that is inaccurate, and it's morally wrong that the government, and it's disingenuous of the government to say that it's about legitimate expectation. But secondly, even if we accept the legitimate expectation argument, which we shouldn't, but even if we did, there are many non-spousal visa migrant women who are subject to abuse, who have a legitimate expectation to stay in the UK. Many have arrived in the UK as partners of those who are settled in the UK, or they themselves have arrived with valid visas and have the same expectation of settlement. So the category of women I'm talking about include, for example, partners of those who arrive, you know, as relevant points-based system migrants. So those partners, or maybe they are en route to settlement with a partner who has limited leave. So there are many categories of women who have a legitimate expectation, and on that basis should benefit from the DV rule and the Ddbc. When their marriage breaks down, they're subject to abuse. The second claim, that any reforms in this area might lead to an exploitation of the immigration system, is a perennial one. Actually, it was raised when we were first asking for the DV rule all those years ago, but it has no basis in evidence. Why? Because the DV rule and the Ddbc, which has operated since 2002 and 2012, respectively, has shown that there is no evidence that the DV rule and the Ddbc has been abused by women, or that they've been used by people to abuse the immigration system. In fact, all the evidence points in the opposite direction. The evidential threshold and the assessment systems that's been put into place for the operation of the DV rule and the Ddbc has worked effectively and has not led to any kind of exploitation. Otherwise, do we really believe this government wouldn't have changed it by now? Wouldn't have abolished it by now if that was happening? And let me give you an example. In response to parliamentary questions, in 2018, the 1,210 Ddbcs, that's not an awful lot, is it, were granted, out of which only 575 victims were subsequently granted leave to remain. Now, that fall is a question in itself, but it shows that the system's working, that there isn't an exploitation of the system because there's an effective evidential threshold and established assessment system. So then let's look at the other argument, the notion that extending the DV rule and the Ddbc to other migrant women would lead to an exploitation of migrant women. I just don't understand that argument, and actually think it's spurious and nonsensical, given that an abuser is hardly likely to support a woman to make a DV application. Why? Because the abuser will be implicated and expose himself to criminal and civil legal proceedings and provide women with access to protection and independence. So there is just, again, no evidence that the DV rule and the Ddbc will lead to abusers encouraging women to make applications and abusing the system in some way. Finally, the government says that it cannot enshrine protection in the bill because of the lack of evidence about the needs of migrant women subject to abuse. Again, this doesn't stand up to scrutiny. We and many people in this meeting have had extensive engagement with the Home Office. We've given copious evidence in the form of oral and written submissions to the Home Office, to parliamentary inquiries and meetings, and there is simply no lack of evidence. There is copious evidence. But the problem is that the government carried out a deeply flawed migrant victim review and an exercise which was lacking in transparency, contained no terms of reference, and ignored all the evidence that was presented. by many of us. So despite all of this, the government has offered a paltry £1.4 million pilot project. It says that's your alternative. That's what you're going to get to support migrant women for a year. The pilot project bids have not yet been announced. Many of us have applied, but we don't know who's going to get it. That would be a question in itself. But separately, in any event, 1.4 million is wholly inadequate. At best, it's likely to provide minimal support to a few hundred women for 3 months each only. Thousands of women will continue to be excluded, and there are no guarantees that following the completion of the project, lasting measures and new laws and reforms will be introduced to protect migrant women. So really, that's where we're at. The amendment has been passed. It's a moment to enjoy and celebrate, but it will get rejected in the House of Commons. So what are we left with? Well, the government's refusal to put into place meaningful support really does amount to the continuation of the hostile, now termed compliant immigration environment. And despite the rhetoric of compassion that came after the Windrush scandal, and more recently in the aftermath of the tragic death of Sarah Everhard, its claim to take women's safety seriously doesn't hold up to scrutiny because they don't mean all women. Clearly, they don't mean migrant women. And its position is wholly at odds with its own legal obligations under the Istanbul Convention, as Gisela has pointed out, and contravenes CEDAW principles. And it's also at odds with strategies and policies to combat violence against women and girls, including its own statutory guidance that recognizes insecure immigration status of women as a significant risk factor. So we should all be worried because all of this comes at a time when there are other deeply regressive moves afoot. These are not choices based on just lack of resources. This is a political choice. It's an ideological position that the government's taking. It's not just trying to do away with migrant women's rights, whatever few there are, and certainly make sure they're not extended, but it's also trying to do away with the very tools that we need to resist, unlawful practices and unfair practices on the part of the state. And at this very moment, the government's carrying out a review into the Human Rights Act. It's carrying out a review into judicial reviews, both of which could be really watered down and both of which are important tools in our armory, in our feminist armory. So we do, I come back to the point, have to think creatively, laterally, and have to find ways of resisting. And I think a lot of that's going to have to take place at local levels. And we're going to have to find ways both of supporting women on a practical level through funds, through whatever we can raise, however we can raise. But politically, I also think that we're going to have to try and see if we can change local authority views. And I do think that this is where our idea of sanctuary cities is a really important one. We're trying to show that if the government doesn't want to lead the way, maybe the mayors of cities might want to lead the way and show that another alternative world that's more fair, that's just, that's more equal is possible. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Pragna. I think that gives us plenty I don't think any one of us intend to not let our MPs know what we still fully expect of them. And tonight we've certainly been given a huge amount of information that helps with that. And it's given some thoughts about what else we can do. And one of the things I would say to you is that a really important way, if you're wondering how you can help, aside from just politically and thinking about the arguments in relation to the bill, I just have to tell you from my point of view how important it is that the voices that you've heard tonight and the organizations that they come from are supported, because they are, it's Pragna and Rosie and Gisela and everyone you've heard from, anyone and many I can see on the Sandhya and many others. These are the organizations that are being, advocating and being a voice for these concerns, and they need your support as well. Can I just hand over to Chitra to organize our breakout rooms?
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you very much to all our speakers. So while we were organizing this, we wanted to give the chance to hear from our speakers, but we also wanted to make this a bit of an activist space as well. So now we've heard from the lived realities of a survivor, the details of the amendments, the government's position. We now want to turn the rest of this conversation to talk about what we're going to do next, and what we all will do, all of us present here, will do to make sure that the protections migrant women need come into place. So we're going to break up into breakout groups now. We'll start off by giving people an opportunity to ask questions of the speakers, after which we will ask you to talk about 3 areas. First of all, what can be done to raise awareness of these issues, even more than is there already? Number 2, what can be done to influence Parliament? And then the third one is a question which Rosie touched on, which Pragna touched on, which is, given where we are at the national level, what can be done locally? What can we do locally in terms of engaging our councillors, our local authorities, our mayors, anybody else, to put forward the changes that we need at the local level if they're not going to happen at the national level? So we'll have about 20-25 minutes for breakout groups. I have set them up already, but please, sometimes Zoom takes a bit of time to put people into breakout groups when there's a few people. So please just have patience and you'll be sorted into your breakout group shortly. I'm opening the breakout groups now. So please just click accept when it comes to the invitation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I think people are potentially slowly coming back into the main room here. And I think as soon as Chitra arrives, she's going to be giving a bit of a summary for us for the next few minutes.
Great, thank you. I'm here, so I can start straight away. Fantastic. I see people are still going with suggestions. So I hope you can all see my screen. Yes? Yep. Okay, great.
Yes.
So as people were talking, we were putting together some of the suggestions that people had to present back to you. You can see that people are still putting together suggestions. But on the first question about raising awareness of issues, you'll see here in the top left-hand corner a number of suggestions around the need for networks of solidarity, for organizations to work with Black and minoritized women, to listen to grassroots organizations and bring in groups that people are already engaged with. We also had a grouping of suggestions around social media, using hashtags, reaching out to influencers, using Facebook rather than Twitter. Suggestion here around protest, around pulling together data, showing the scale of the problem. Then some ideas around looking to working with employers and small businesses and raising awareness around that. And then at the bottom right corner here, around using survivor testimonies and voices, as we did tonight, to really center their experiences in what we're discussing. Moving on to the next, I see lots of people had lots to talk about awareness, and maybe we ran out of time when it came to parliamentary influencing. But we, of course, getting in touch with our local MPs, and Laws actually has a template letter which they will circulate, which you can use to write to your own MP. The need to make a lot of noise, see what happened in terms of school meals and Margaret Rashford. It shows that public opinion is actually really important to the government. And then having to strategize to try and get the Conservatives on board, given that they're the ones whose votes will make the difference in the Commons. And then finally, what can be done locally in terms of safe reporting and service provision, setting up sanctuary cities, lots of suggestions in the middle here around linking with local authorities, challenging commissioning processes, feeding into local violence against women and girls strategies, learning from other local authorities which have better practice. So you can say, for example, oh, do you know what Manchester is doing? Why don't we do that here in Oxford? Using the press to keep local governance like mayors accountable, and then of course donating to local services. So let me stop there and hand back to Nicole to close. But I just want to end by saying, I think in our group, we talked about how important having the space together to come together was, and that we wanted to continue offering spaces like this for people to come together across the country. We had lots of IDVAs and social workers and other people engaged in the system together in our session. So it'd be good to see how we can keep that process going forwards. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That's really helpful. Amazing to do that in real time. Sandhya, did you want to talk about the Northeastern, sorry, you wanted to talk about the Northern Network, sorry.
Yeah, not just the Northeast, this is the Northern Network. So we were looking at when we're talking, we've been talking today, we've been talking to the breakout rooms, we've been talking a bit, what can we do, what can we can take action for? There are two things that are taking place at the moment that I want to draw people's attention to. The first can be found on our website, which is our 10 key recommendations to Greater Manchester Combined Authority on how to creatively support migrant women subject to no recourse to public funds. And I think that is important, because that is about us saying, based on our experts and our experience and the experts in the field, we know what works, we know what can be done. We also know the law, we know the hostile environment, but working around that, here are 10 key recommendations that we think will work, we know will work to support women. I think that's absolutely crucial, that commissioners and local authority people don't just see immigration and go stop, don't just see the domestic bill and go, oh, well, I can't do anything about that. There are things that can be done. Right, so please check that out. That's on our website. The second thing is, and the big up the North, we are launching the Northern No Recourse to Public Funds Women's Network, and this is a group of women's organisations, by and for and BME majority led, who have the expertise and the experience of yeah, big up the North, man, who have the expertise, the experience on the field with working with the women. They know the areas, they know what needs to be done, join together to collectively have a policy voice, to make sure that our needs and our voice is heard, and it is heard in Westminster as well, because not least we're not in the bill, but we're not at the tables, we're not the influencers, we're not able to lobby, we're not able to go down. We are smaller organisations, we are quite segregated, extremely isolated, and often working on a shoestring. So I really want to say that Northern No Recourse to Public Funds Women's Network is going to be extremely powerful and extremely, you know, a really important launch in terms of what we were all saying today, including Pragna and Rosie, Isella and Nicole and ourselves, which is we need to find creative ways of getting our voice out there, because it's not being heard in Westminster, and we fear that it won't be heard in the Commons. So I just want to posit those two things there. Please look at the website, our website, and you will find the information. Thank you.
What a positive way to end. I love it. It's great. And I'm delighted to think about that network forming and the policy voice that it can have, because I completely recognize that is a huge need. And I could hear in our breakout room how interested people are to get involved. And so, you know, I do in this position go to a lot of Zoom events, and I knew I would find this event so inspiring, but I really have, and I think you all have too. There's a real clarity of vision here, and a real, you know, willingness for everyone to act. And I do encourage us, I know we're looking beyond the bill in some of what we're talking about, but please let's spend some time in the short term to really make sure that that our position is known about these amendments. And let's not lose sight of the fact that MPs are responsible to you know, represent the views of their constituents. And we really want to just get the word out and have a really strong final push on these amendments. And, you know, let's never say never, even given some of what we've talked about tonight. And certainly there are ways and strategies that will work together beyond the bill, certainly. But I do want to thank all of the speakers. I want to thank each and every one of you who's been here over the kind of, you know, after work dinner hour, and how many people have remained. And I just want to thank you all for your interest. Thanks the speakers. Thanks Lars for organizing tonight, who need a round of applause, the whole team there. They're so inspirational, each and every one of them. And so I just want to say, let's get these amendments done. Let's try as much as we possibly can. Everyone take some time tonight to spread the word. Take a look at the 10-point plan on the website. You know, really have a look at that. And so that Safety4Sisters website, I had to remind myself before I misspoke, but I'm going to be looking at it as soon as we log off. And thank you again for coming, and thanks for letting me be a part of it. I feel really honored to have been asked. So thanks everyone. Have a great night. And only 3 minutes over. That's not too bad. Not too bad. Have a good night, everyone. And let's all stay involved and stay connected. Take care. Bye-bye.